Why don't you tell us a bit about you, what you do, where you're from, a bit of your maybe some of your spiritual background as well. I'm assuming you're not a Mormon, based on your comment.
Not a Mormon. I did have, So I'll just say this before we start: is that I was raised in a kind of Christianity where, slightly so, not a lot of it, but slightly like, what is a cult and where are the boundary lines and stuff like that. And I had a slight fascination for a really short period of time. I went to a Baptist high school, and there was a class in cults, and nowadays I just think about the whole thing so differently than I did, or I was taught to think about it, but
it's
anyway,
really hard when you've grown up in religion not to be fascinated by cults, though. There's something that draws you in and goes, man, I like a lot of these elements. I like the community. Yeah. I like the tightness and the family dynamics. And then you look at, but that's weird. So you're not allowed to leave, or if you do leave, like this or that. And it's, and then when you have been in religion in quite a few different of its flavors, you do also go, there's quite a lot of elements that make up a cult. You don't have every single proponent in most churches, but you definitely have some of the proponents in most churches. Some of the key elements that you tick to make up a cult. Yeah. 3 or 4 of them are usually in most churches, And so it's quite a bizarre dynamic, right? It really does require everything to truly be a cult. That's
true.
We all are cultish in a sense, aren't we, I guess?
Yeah, that's true. Well, okay, so good to be with you. But what's the program is called?
It's just the Phil Drysdale Show. I used to have a different name.
Oh, right, Phil
Drysdale Show. I changed so much, and I'm constantly evolving and bringing in different people that I wanted to have something that was just centered around just my name, generic. Because every new name you come up with falls out of fashion in a couple of months, and it just was getting weird. So welcome to the Phil Drysdale Show. It's so egotistical, right? I hate it, but I love it as well.
That's great. That's great. No, it's fine. No problem at all. So it's good to be with you and with your listeners. I grew up in the southern United States with grandparents that came from Pentecostal backgrounds. And young enough that they were like, when the Pentecostal movement was starting to happen, they were, second generation people, in that. And in the hills of East Tennessee, and on the coast of Carolina and Florida. So that's where people are from, a little bit of Georgia. And so my parents were raised very definitely in that ethos, Pentecostal, Southern Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, Southern Pentecostal. My mother was raised all up and down Florida because my grandfather was a pastor in the Church of God. So, and I remember as a boy, he was still an active minister, and I went and stayed with them from time to time, and they were in various towns. I mean, even as in my boyhood, he was being moved around quite a bit, and everywhere from Key West to the Panhandle, and then everywhere in between. And then our family are from on my mother's side are all over the state of Florida, and so you have these things like family reunions where generations of everybody comes together and people travel from all over the place. Once a year, you'd have these like events. My father's parents are from East Tennessee, and from the research I've done, we've been here from the British Isles on both sides of my family for about 300 years. So we've been here a long time. And on both sides of the family. And so it goes back quite a long ways. And but I'm still it's interesting because, these things keep evolving in what we know about DNA, but according to, the research we've done, I'm still sitting here in America, 270, 250 years into my family's immigrating from England, 90%.
Wow.
Anglo-Saxon. I don't know.
Dang.
How does that happen?
Yeah, jeez.
A little bit of Viking, and that's it.
That's like some, pedigree breeding through your line. Where are you from?
Yeah.
Are you sure you're from England?
I'm like, I want to be a dual citizen. I need a passport.
Yeah, seriously. Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, but anyway, so my parents met in Orlando. My mother was at nursing school. My dad was. That's where my dad's parents had settled from East Tennessee, is in Orlando. My dad's father was a carpenter, day laborer, and they settled down there. And he went to high school in Orlando, and my parents met there in a Church of God. My dad went to Lee College, which is now Lee University, also in Cleveland, Tennessee. And they got married. My dad was in the military. And he was an airborne ranger, an officer.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was young, we got moved around all over the place, Georgia and California and different places. But on his third tour of duty in Vietnam, he was killed in 1970, July of 1970. So that really set my life in a different,
I bet.
course.
What age were you then?
I was almost 5 years old.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And for a couple of months, I went to live with one of his military buddies when my mother was trying to sort her life out in California. And then we came back, and I have 3 sisters. My mother built a house in Orlando. And we continued to go to my dad's parents' congregation in Orlando, the Church of God, and where my mother had gotten, over the years, been married about 7 or 8 years to my dad at the time, and gotten to know a lot of people in the congregation. And I was raised in that church on Orange Avenue there in Orlando. So that was the seedbed of so much of, and very typical Southern Pentecostal church, a very dispensational eschatology, but I always like to start out with Pentecostalism and what I admire about it. And my grandparents were very earnest people on both, really what we would consider today, if they were in the middle class, it was like barely, and, my grandmother, my dad's father had a stroke, my dad's mother had to, go work in factories, and they had a very strict sort of rhythm of life, and Sabbath was the Sabbath. And so she worked in the factories for 5 days, and then she would all Saturday was, gardening, cleaning, cooking. And a lot of times, I was like, my 3 younger sisters would stay with my mother. I would go there for the weekend.
Right.
And so a lot of my rhythms and everything came from her.
Wow.
And my dad's mother. And they were all 4 of my grandparents were very earnest people. Whenever I think about Pentecostalism, I think about prayer. I mean, these were people that really spent a lot of time in prayer. And they
how
would
did
read
that affect you then at that age? Like, did you appreciate those things at that time, or was something that?
Absolutely.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah. And people who were preaching, and I'm not preaching, but my grandfather was preaching, but reading the scriptures. And so people tend to think of like, speaking in tongues and rolling around in the floors, which I saw some, and more so on my mother's side of things. But they were just deeply earnest people. And my grandmother work ethic was unbelievable. And she would set aside this day of rest for herself and for her family and friends. So on Sundays after church, it wasn't just family, but she would invite other people to her table on Sunday. And she would prepare these massive meals of food of all kinds, and on, you know, very, I mean, they weren't wealthy, you know,
Sure.
but, you know, just, and sharing. And so, and church was like 3 hours on Sunday morning. And then you went and had your big feast, and you sat, you know, you rested the afternoon and you went back to church at night.
Yeah.
You know, so it was very, very routine to spend 3 hours in church in the morning and 3 hours in church at night. And then of course they had revivals and other things that would, you know, bring you back into church during the week, you know, occasionally through the year. And, so that was, you know, I was raised in that, and there's a lot of beauty in it. And that's where I start. There was also, you know, there were also strange, you know, aspects to it, like dispensational eschatology that, you know, Hal Lindsey, you know, David Wilkerson, kind of end of the world sayings that you would see a lot of times in Baptist circles. So a lot of similarity in Southern Pentecostalism with Baptist, you know, beliefs and teachings.
Sure.
You know, except they also spoke in tongues, you know.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of similarities there. And you know, they used to scare the hell. I mean, you know, when I remember as a young boy, again, there were wonderful aspects, like these camp meetings that they would have, and you would go, and as a kid, there was all kinds of fun activities and things that you could do as a kid. But, you know, you would get, and I remember this really, really strange and fascinating and wonderful, but bizarre couple that would go. They were children's evangelists, and they had these like elaborate shows that they would do, and they would come to your church, but they would also, you would see them at camp meetings and stuff. And there was like puppets and like black light stuff and all this kind of thing. And it was kind of always centered on like the idea that, you know, you're a sinner, and, you know,
excuse me,
and you've got to ask Jesus into your heart and stuff, like, but told in children's stories and things like that, with a kind of edge, like this needs to happen, or, you know, really bad things are going to happen in your life. But also just wonderfully told, and very Southern and Gothic and I once did a research and found out who this couple was and like how long they did their thing. And it's so fascinating. But yeah, I remember being, you know, I was probably 9 years old the first time I saw Thief in the Night. Like, you know, they played that film in church, you know, like on a Tuesday
quite
or
a
Wednesday
harrowing
night.
thing to watch as a 9-year-old.
Yeah, as a kid, you know, and you're like, you know, of course, for people who have never seen it, like the theme is that there's the rapture, and everybody is taken away, and everyone who's left kind of has to go through this horrific experience of a sort of all-encompassing sort of George Orwell 1984 style government thing. And you end up, there's guillotines and things like that. And you end up, you know, if you're a believer, you know, you would end up being killed if you were left behind, type of thing. Yeah. And yeah, it is scary. It was scary. And the object of the films were to scare the hell out of you into, you know, trusting in God, you know, you know, a lot of this kind of like, where would you be in general? What would happen to you if you died tomorrow or the next day or whatever? And there tended to be this thing like of getting recommitted to, you know, God. And so people would, you know, literally, you know, from week to week get saved on a Sunday between, you know,
I'm a pastor's kid, so I covered my bases like 20, 40, 50 times as like a teenager kid. Like you frequently go, am I though? You know, you have those doubts creep in and you're thinking of something like Thief in the Night, and you're like, I'm going to cover my bases, put my hand up and go forward just one more time. You know, I'm pretty sure I'm saved, but maybe I'll just recommit, you know, dedicate, that kind of idea.
very much that kind of culture, and
Yeah.
people really, and sometimes it literally was also, they kind of were just living like anyone else in the world, and then
Yeah.
by Sunday they needed to go to confession. It was
Right.
it
It's
was
like a
a
reset
it was
switch.
it was a reset, right? And so there was also a part of the culture that you also you might lose zeal, right? And you need to
Mm.
be like reignited within your within your faith. You And not only that you could lose salvation, but you could lose your fire,
Mm. Yeah.
within that context. There was also a lot of sort of, especially for my mother, by the time it got to my generation, there wasn't as much of, she didn't impose as much of this on me as was imposed on her, but a very external holiness kind of approach to things.
Yeah.
Women didn't wear slacks. Women wore their hair up. Women didn't cut their hair. Men did. No jewelry, no makeup. My mother grew up not attending theaters or public sporting
Right.
events or entertainments and things like that, which were all, and of course, no drinking, no smoking, and this sort of thing. Literally down to like if you were going swimming, there was a pool for the men, there's a pool for the
Wow.
women, and even like at these camps and things like that, there were separate, what they would call mixed bathing, right? But it doesn't have anything to do with
Sure.
getting
Different
clean or whatever.
connotation.
Just yeah, right. So and again, also bathed inside of sort of Southern culture a lot. And again, lots of old saints. I had Sunday school teachers that were wonderful people, lots of older Christians that were like mentors to me as a little
Mm.
child in faith, who I just love and still love, and many of whom I stayed in connection to up until their, some of them, very few of them, but a couple of them are still alive.
Wow.
Who I love and who mentored me in trust, and
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, and you pray through for the gift of speaking in tongues and that sort of thing. So that was my, that was the world in which I
Yeah.
grew up in
And
faith.
did you grow up like, because I know like there's a fascinating piece of data that I've come across that talks about in the last kind of like 20 years, they looked at people between the age of 18 and 29 that have left the church. And they said, when did you decide to leave the church? And over 80% of them decided before they were 14. And so there's this huge dynamic at play for a lot of teenagers that are in the mix of this. Their parents are dragging them along to church, but they don't want to be there. And we all know that kind of stereotype or whatever. And a lot of us have been that. I remember being that as a teenager. And so how did you engage with this kind of world? Did you love being a part of church? Did you love that dynamic? Did you kind of resent it? I want to go and hang out with my friends, or, how did you navigate that world? Because it's quite an intense world as well. Like you're describing it. It's like, this isn't, pop to church for an hour and you're done. It's like all day Sunday. It's
not at all.
week meetings. It's how you live your life day in, day out.
Yeah, it was all encompassing. The church and your relationships within the church and the families that went to the church were your community. I mean, you might, you went to school and you had, parents had jobs and things, but your social life was very much that group of people. Even in a developing city like Orlando, the relationships were, and they had ball clubs, they had softball teams and for the church, and things that like kept you together as well during the week. Wednesday services, was routine. Things like Awana, which is like a version of Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts for children. So there's lots of culture that kept you together during the week too. I loved it. I loved my friends. I loved church. I like I said, I love the people. I think early on, I I didn't realize it at the time as a child, but there were areas that I was skeptical. And I think some of it came from my father's mother, who was very influential on her name was Leela. And again, the factory worker who, had to work outside the home because my grandfather was very disabled from a stroke. And she, she kind of, I remember sitting in the pew with her, and she always had, mints or gum or something for me. And, but, there were times when somebody would like be very, very demonstrative. And she would lean into me and say, that's not the Lord, that's not the Spirit, that's somebody just being, and, just that's, in other words, kind of like discriminating about like, what was a pure manifestation of the Spirit and what was someone's just emotion, and maybe she put a little bit of that in me, but there was a love, but there was, kind of a distance too. My mother remarried when I was almost 10 to a man who was a youth pastor in the Church of God, and then eventually became like an associate pastor. And he and his family, who were actually here in Pontiac, north of Detroit, that's where they were raised. We were living in Florida still, but he took us within a few years, out of the Church of God into like more independent, charismatic circles. And he started a church in Orlando, and then he moved us to California to become part of a multi-staff church in Tustin, California in 1980. And that move out of like Pentecostalism and in the charismatic world was a move from a settled culture of like Southern Pentecostalism into like every kind of imaginable teacher and movement and idea. And my dad was, and my mother with him were insatiable, and all these kind of like ideas that were out there. Yeah. Some of which were interesting, like they got into Keswick, right? Which in England was a really interesting movement to me. And a lot of times they would like bring us along and here, read this, or and I was really interested in Keswick. But they Jesse Penn Lewis and Smith Wigglesworth and like Watchman Nee and all of these kind of figures, many of from decades and decades in the past, but also more contemporary figures like Dennis Bennett, who was an Episcopalian who had an experience with glossolalia, and many people are like saw as like the beginning of the charismatic renewal, which was this idea of the gift of the Spirit and the spiritual gifts hitting all of the churches, right? Not just the Pentecostal, but Lutherans and Baptists and Catholics and everything. So, but there were also, like really strange figures like Kenneth Copeland and others that they, would listen to. Others that were much more, I found much more compelling, like Merlin Carruthers and people like that, Prison to Praise, people like Chuck Colson and others. So they were just into everything. And the move to California was such a culture shock.
Yeah, I bet from the south to California is a change anyway, and then you've got the religious shift, and you're being exposed to lots of different ideas.
Lots of different ideas, some really quacky and wild, and then other things kind of a little more mainstream, like, okay, this is, and I think as a child, I had a lot of like that sounds interesting to me, but that sounds bizarre kind of thing going on, And, but your parents, you do what your parents are doing.
Absolutely.
And I never like youth group was in high school, and even in the Baptist high school that I went to, my friends were, settled believers, and, I didn't have an experience like, oh, this is, I feel where I felt alienated, from the church or culture. I had skepticism, but anyway, I ended up for a year at Southern California College after high school, which is a 4-year school of the Assemblies of God in Costa Mesa. And it was there that I began to really be introduced very rapidly to like much larger streams of Christian thought. A very, very different for a kid who was raised in Pentecostal charismatic churches. Some of the faculty were missionaries in South America, and they had been exposed to liberation theology.
Okay.
And were teaching.
Brilliant.
Some
I
of
was
that.
going to say, in an AOG like institution, like AOG, probably not known for being the most kind of like, let's explore all these different ideas. They're pretty rigid.
This was a really different school, and I think at the time, the faculty were very cutting edge within the assemblies. So I was it was very intellectually like curious and all over the map. And I myself became, when I was in high school, I was reading a lot of Francis Schaeffer. I mean, even in high school, I was reading a lot of books. And then when I was there, I started being introduced to, just in my own reading, I read a bunch of Frederick Buechner in my first year in college, who, obviously took me in more of a mainline, Protestant, some ideas and things that I'd never been exposed to. And people like, that he studied under at Union Seminary in New York, like Paul Tillich, and people that were interesting to him, like Karl Barth and others, who, in being a charismatic kid and in high school, Baptist school, reading Francis Schaeffer and stuff. I mean, the taxonomy Schaeffer gives you is like, Barth is bad, and, that's like neo-orthodoxy and all this. And I began to like encounter like, just a lot of different ideas, and I was interested in all of it. I had a professor there that was very into Eastern Orthodoxy. We read a bunch of Orthodox. This was all in my first year of college. I got exposed also to different ideas of, political ideas by these, a lot of these teachers, and my parents were not happy about that. And
were your parents fairly conservative then, presumably growing up in Church of God, Southern?
Yeah. And their politics were very conservative, and I was reading a number of sort of more left-leaning political sources in college, and came home talking, a lot of these ideas, and they got very suspicious and pulled me out of that school and sent me to Oral Roberts University and told me
much safer, much safer.
What people don't understand about ORU, especially in that period, was how very diverse it is. I mean, what they didn't know was that by the mid 80s, it had been captured spiritually and culturally by Word of Faith movement. Yeah. And very much the Rhema, crowd, Hagen, Copeland, but other kind of celebrity, teachers and so forth. So the culture of the school, which was founded in the 60s as the first university of the Charismatic movement. So you had faculty from, people that taught at Missouri and Brown and other places that were like Catholics or Methodists or Presbyterians or whatever, and they wanted to be part of the first charismatic university. And, people, very sound scholars in their field, and they came together and they were still part of the school in the mid 80s when I got there. It'd only been 20 years. So the faculty were amazing. And so I kept, even though the spiritual culture was odd to say the least, and very much focused on, sort of external, these are the things that we do as a community, and we don't do these things. And We had chapel services multiple mornings a week. You had to go to church on Sunday and actually give the church bulletin to your, resident director at the dorm, to prove that you'd been to church. You weren't allowed to sleep in.
Dude, tell me someone had set up a small business, collecting church bulletins, selling them on the sides. Like, that's a good moneymaker right there. You're getting an insight into who I would have been at Oral Roberts University.
Yeah. Good times. Yeah, you could, go around to church and grab a few, and then you can sell them to people, right?
Sell them to your mates. You get to sleep in on Sunday.
Amazing.
Stay in bed.
Wow, how did I not think of that while I was there?
Oh man.
So, I was bristling against some of that. I think I was beginning to. But like I said, the classroom at ORU was really world class. I mean, we were reading Abraham Heschel and Flannery O'Connor, Catholic writers, all sorts of interesting people, and so actually the intellectual journey, continued, right?
That's awesome.
Yeah. And although, the fact that they'd made this huge playpen, right? That's what ORU was. I mean, it's like, Christian, you can send your kids here and, they'll continue to be inoculated from the world. They'll be in this intense spiritual environment. They'll stay on the path, right? That's, this is the idea. And I kind of, I was beginning to get to the point where I was a little like aware that was part of what was going on and resisting that a little bit, but not, it wasn't bothering me a whole lot. What was bothering me and had that it had intensified over the years was just, I was becoming less and less interested and more resistant to what I considered to be like bizarre ideas and teachings,
Okay.
I was getting lots of it at ORU. I mean, the chapel services were very focused on, you should be fantastically successful and completely healthy, and everything should be going well in your life. And if it's not, either there's something wrong with what you're doing in your life, or you don't have enough faith, right? And so it was a very transactional idea of God and the world and the human being within the world, and so you were either in favor with this God by holding certain beliefs or qualities of belief, right? And intensity of belief, and living in certain ways. And if you were doing those things, everything should more or less be working out in your life, right? And so this came to a head in a particular moment. And it was a chapel service, 1986, January. The Shuttle Challenger had launched and exploded. And that morning we'd all seen it because ORU is a TV campus, and I still have friends that work in television and news and in Hollywood and films and things that went there. We had closed circuit TV in our rooms, in the learning facilities, everything. So we all get there to chapel in the morning, like late morning for chapel for lunch. And everyone has seen this disaster and everybody's talking about it. We go into the service, and the man who's the student pastor, the leader of spiritual life on campus, says we got up and said, look, this horrible thing has happened. It's horrific, but we're here to worship God. We're here to praise God, and we're here to lift him high and so forth and so on. And, they had big praise bands and singers, and very good. It was a music school too. And they just launched into this, singing and carrying on like they always did. And I just found myself sitting down. I'm sure it wasn't the first time I had done this, but just like, this doesn't make any sense to me. Why? And I wasn't, I didn't understand the concept of lament at the time, but I was like, why can't we invite this tragedy into this worship space?
Yeah.
And maybe pray and meditate on what's happened, and maybe we could all, people could share how they're feeling about it, whatever. I don't know that I was like working through all of that in the moment, but what I was deciding was, I can't do that.
Yeah.
I cannot sit here and just, be euphoric and go to this place where I'm, raising my hands and, worshiping God when I have such deep sorrow and perplexity over this thing that's happened. Because back then our national identity was tied into the space program and all kinds of other things. I was raised in Florida, Cape Canaveral. My uncle worked on the Cape and stuff. And so it was just hard. And I remember thinking, this is just wrong. And the first time I'd ever seen this happen, I don't remember it happening before or after. A member of the theological faculty was the preacher for the service. And he wrote a book called From the Pinnacle of the Temple. His name's Charles Farah. And he got up, and the first thing he said was, I want to tell you today about an experience I've had the last couple of years, my wife dying from cancer, and how we came to experience our suffering together as a participation in the suffering of Christ.
Wow.
And how we came to understand that Christ was present and suffering with us. So this sort of mutual co-suffering that was going on. And I was like, I want to know more about that.
That's such a foreign concept to the majority of kind of charismatic, Pentecostal, I dare I even say it, American Christianity. That
for sure.
inflation of success, winning, do the right things, be on God's side, and it's better. That thing that you were kind of in that service, in that very same service, going, I don't like this. It's just so antithetical. It's just totally the opposite of how the culture runs, really.
You don't find it as much and you don't find it as much among classical Pentecostalism. You don't find that dichotomy as much as you did in sort of like a lot of sort of independent charismatic, and then increasingly, but what I didn't cover from that Pentecostal experience was there is this escapism that's there in the eschatology and the rapture, like, the world will suffer, but we'll be taken out, or you can have suffering in the world, but we look forward to just leaving all this behind and going somewhere, to another place. And that was very much in Pentecostal spirituality. You would go to church to escape the world of trouble, and to transcend suffering to this higher plane of existence. And and the worship was geared toward that emotional payoff. And that was similar between classical Pentecostal and charismatic spirituality. Is it's about, escaping your troubles and going to this higher plane of, spiritual existence, where the physical and the moral and the material is left behind, right? here there was a hint that there was something redemptive going on in the suffering, and that God was present with this couple in the material world and in their suffering, wasn't far from them, but was actually drawn toward them, and their, in their sense of it, there became aware of a deep presence of God in the midst of their suffering, right?
Yeah.
You know, the sun rises and falls and comes and goes, but we become aware as we get older that we're the ones that are moving, right? It's not the sun or the moon that are moving. It's us that are, well, actually the sun and the moon are also moving, but like, you know, from our orientation, they're coming and going, but they're always present.
Yeah.
It was the suffering that made them more aware of the presence of God that was already there, unbidden, right, in their life. And he was in the middle of it. Well, within a few weeks, I came across a book by a man named Tom Howard, who had been teaching at Gordon College. And in the first chapter, he's talking in ways that were, I was like, oh, wow, this guy was, even though he was raised evangelical and I was raised Pentecostal, there's so much that's the same for us. Lots and lots of the blood of Jesus, you know, prayer, personal reading of scripture, personal prayer, flannel graphs in Sunday school, you know, all of this stuff. And I'm like, yep. And I'm like thinking, all along I'm thinking, my thoughts are like, this is beautiful. I love this. I loved it when I was a kid. I love what he's saying. But then he got to the end of that first chapter. He's like, but I realized it wasn't enough, you know? And in the second chapter, he starts going into an encounter he has with Irenaeus and the idea of recapitulation, in which it's not just about my personal salvation, but that God becomes flesh. God becomes material in order to rescue the material world from its captivity to death. And not just my soul, but he's come to rescue the humanity. It's not just personal, it's social. It's not just personal, it's the creation. And I had never been introduced to this, the beauty of the incarnation. And what does it mean that God becomes one with the world that he creates? And that the story starts not with the fall, but the story, and this is well before I read N.T. Wright or anybody, the story starts with a good creation and a humanity, a creation that's made good, and a humanity that's made in the image of a good God. And that the humanity and the world are inherently, you know, created good by a good God. And that, yes, there's this turning away from love that results in death, a turning away from the divine community that results in death, and that God wants to, Bonhoeffer, as we seek to escape our humanity, God becomes human, right? We seek to escape the world, God enters the world. And of course, I, you know, hadn't encountered Bonhoeffer at that moment, but I was like, oh, this is what's missing, right? And this is what I need to understand. And it set me off on a decade journey, you know, 30 plus years now of reading the first Christians and seeing, and so much of it has been, some of it's been involved repentance of, you know, ideas that were present in Pentecostal and charismatic spirituality. Some of it's been especially when it comes to classical Pentecostalism, a coming to continue to love aspects of where I came from. But it's definitely been transfiguring of all of my experiences. And and it's got, you know, with the gospel that the first Christians were proclaiming and living. You know, it's not just like at ORU, there was a man named Bob Stamps. He wrote a hymn called "God and Man at Table or Sit Down." He had just finished his doctorate at St. Andrews and came to ORU in my almost final year there, and he had set up this thing called Vespers, and on Sunday evenings. And remember, ORU has Presbyterians and Episcopalians and Methodists, and in that service was a participation in the Eucharist.
Okay.
And I started, after this experience in chapel, I started going to Vespers and started encountering Jesus in the broken bread and in the offered cup. and that just led me, you know, both the reading and that physical sacrament led me deeper into the teaching and practices of the first Christians. And I began to find there just a wisdom and a depth and a affirmation of the world, and of God's creation. God isn't interested in destroying the world. He's interested in making of me and of the humanity and of the creation a new creation. Because there was very much in my Pentecostal and charismatic spirituality, God is done with this world. This world is headed towards destruction. There's a new heaven and new earth, in a literal sense of this. God will do away with,
torch this place.
And here was a story of a God who, as we're seeking to escape our humanity, escape the world, he comes into it because he doesn't want to see it fall into non-existence, but to participate in his permanence, you know. And so even at the, you know, the idea of entropy, right, is that it's, you know, God wants to rescue the cosmos from entropy and to arrest its fall into non-existence, and to grant to the whole cosmos and to us his kind of existence. Of course, this is an Athanasius, but all of them, it wasn't just the depth of their meditation on the person of Jesus as what it means to be human and what it means to be God at the same time, in the same space, and their meditation on the triune nature of the one God, and all these kind of things that we tend to think, but it was also their orientation to the poor and their orientation toward the oppressed, and this radical commitment they had to caring for widows and orphans and the stranger and the foreigner. And, you know, that's really what converted the Roman Empire, you know, was not just their gospel preaching, but the way that they, you know, their God made them vulnerable also to people that everybody else just ignored or didn't care. That, you know, the hospitals that they built and the orphanages that they built, and the taking care of, you know, Rodney Stark's wonderful book where he, you know, documents that really, you know, and, you know, there's a newer book called the Patient Ferment of the Early Church, in which their radical commitment to the marginalized and the vulnerable just changed over centuries, not just their suffering in the Colosseums and so forth, but their orientation just was what was like a leaven in the bread of Roman society. And it led eventually to, you know, conversion of the whole thing. And of course, there's all kinds of problems with that. But and
it's interesting to me what you're talking about here is, you know, like when you look at the very early church, so before what we really know, because there's this gap in history, really, isn't there, where we don't really know what much of church looked like. But we know that there was these different communities that were kind of like presenting the gospel slightly differently. And what we have today is what was certainly there, and it kind of ultimately won the majority of the story. Most Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant kind of comes from that field. But what's interesting to me is the other group that, you know, comes up often is the Gnostics. That kind of, they were trying to escape the body, escape this world. They did see, you know, the dirt, the physicality is just, it was evil, it was dirty, it was not good. We need to get rid of that. They wouldn't have thought, oh, a beggar, we should look, you know, care for. Well, who cares? That's just a physical flesh anyway, like whatever. And so that seemed to lose out in history. You know, it was certainly a strong, and it was the main view in certain pockets in the early church. And it lost the discussion, the fight, whatever grounds they had to argue their point, they lost. What's interesting is it seems to me what you're highlighting here is this subtle reintroduction of quite Gnostic beliefs, in a sense of, we're filthy, we're rotten, we're trying to escape that, we're trying to transcend that. You know, the earth, God doesn't love. I mean, yeah, God loves the earth, but He doesn't love the earth, and we shouldn't love the earth, and we shouldn't, you know, hold on to beauty, you know, life, the earth, trees, deer. I don't know, you know, all these things. We shouldn't be looking at those as beautiful, but really, it's spiritual stuff. It's only spiritual stuff. You know, this hating of, we only value the spiritual stuff, the going to church, the reading the Bible, the, you know, whatever it is, youth club on Wednesdays and midweek service on Tuesday or whatever. And we don't really appreciate, you know, whatever it is, learning, academia, you know, finding truth in the world, going to a football game with your family, you know, sex with your wife. Like, these are all, the early church would have been strong proponents of God being in that. You know, that was the point of incarnation, was to kind of bring a reality of heaven into the moment. What do you think it is that's shifted the church back into kind of some of these Gnostic views? Like, because it seems like you've thought about this kind of perspective of how this is kind of captured the church, and how there almost needs to be an awakening of recentering into the very real, physical, tangible. It's the bread and the wine, right? It's the body, it's the blood. There's that need for that orientation, but it feels like we've let that slip to some degree. I say we very loosely when I talk about the church. Of course, loads of church traditions do it fantastic.
It's really exciting to me that people are rediscovering across denominations and backgrounds and movements this aspect of, you know, the first Christians' way in the world is, looking at the year and celebrating the various aspects of the life of Christ within, by keeping Advent, and by keeping Lent, and celebrating Holy Week. And you'll see it in a Baptist church, you'll see it in some charismatic churches that are leaning into this. Of course, you know, in the mainline churches, and of course the Catholic and Orthodox and Anglican settings, this has always been part of it. But to see the free churches, you know, adopting some of these practices is wonderful to me. You know, I don't think people have to become Catholic or Orthodox or Anglican as I have to experience these things. I think that whatever culture or church that you're part of, we can remember, and we can re-embrace these things that have been lost. And I see it happening, and it's a beautiful thing. One of my early mentors, Robert Webber, who went from sort of a fundamentalist evangelical into, you know, the Episcopal Church, and wrote a number of books about it that have been very influential in the movements in America. You know, would have been so happy to see within a church that, you know, maybe even still has a very charismatic culture, an embrace of weekly Eucharist, and you know, a paying attention to the sacred year and so forth. I do think that you know, people are looking for ways to integrate their faith with their everyday existence and in the world. And there's this we're waking up again to the intuition that the world, that the God in the depths of the earth and the world is a goodness that cannot be blasted out of it. You know, there's a goodness that despite its tragedies and chaos and everything, there is something redeemable and something God is seeking to redeem. And so it's it is a rediscovery of something that was there and that was lost, particularly in the West. And I think some of it comes in by people who were part of things like Manichaeism, right, where you had this very, monad like God, where both everything that is good and everything that is evil comes from the same source, which isn't the gospel, and which brought in some of these strange Persian and Greek ideas back into the church that separated. There's the created order that is made by a lesser God, and it's passing away and so forth and so on. And this, hatred of the body, hatred of female bodies in particular, this strange ideas that aren't Hebraic at all of sex and of, even I think Augustine, right, his own licentiousness and his history around sex and his aversion to some of his extremes before his conversion began to lay seeds that become very problematic later, even if he didn't intend them to go in quite the direction that they did. So that, things become like sex itself is identified with the fall, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than something that's part of the good creation from the beginning, and that's all part of the goodness of the created order, and becomes something that's dark and sinister and bad, and even in some places, the locus of how sin, right, enters in and is transmitted, right, from generation to generation. Mm-hmm. Over time, yes, the church begins to be infected with, anti-material, anti-creation, anti-body, anti-pleasure, anti-female seeds, right? That began to sprout into very quickly into things that would have been, foreign to the first Christians, and their ideas. So,
It sounds like the Eucharist to you is a very centering piece around a lot of this. Am I fair in saying that that's quite?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
How do you think that serves in bringing that grounding, in bringing kind of that component to what do you see as its importance in faith? Because to me, I look across most Christian tradition, you're going to find some way, shape, or form Eucharist taking place. But in my experience, some forms of Eucharist are potentially actually quite damaging, even, in how they, or maybe the stories that surround them, the narratives that they're found within, can often, in my opinion, do more harm than good, potentially. So like, what does that look like for you, for Eucharist to be a healthy practice, a healthy part of bringing humans a taste of heaven, a wholeness, a reality of Christ, whatever that looks like for you, I guess?
Yeah. Well, it is man offering back to God in thanksgiving. Eucharist means thanksgiving. Offering the world back to God and his existence in the world back to God in thanksgiving. And it's a particular human who's doing this. The human that is born of Mary, by the power of the Spirit. The Son of God becomes flesh and offers his body back to God on behalf of the world to redeem the world, and makes his body available to us and under these forms of the bread and wine. And it's a very inclusive meal, isn't it? I mean, when you go back to the first celebration of it, which is, in many scholars' minds, a conversion of Passover into a new covenant, right? A new Passover from life to death, from death to life.
Yeah.
And death is converted to life. In that first meal, there is a doubter at the table, There is a denier at the table. There's a betrayer at the table. And God gives freely of himself to all of them. It's the church that has, in various ways, in the centuries that followed, began to treat it as a, this is how you're part of, our particular club, right?
Yeah.
Is that you're welcome at this meal. I believe that it is all of God offering all of God's self to the whole world for its salvation. And, of course, it's a reminder that, this physical world can become, as it does in the body of Jesus, the means of the world's redemption, and that it's available to everyone. And it's available, Wesley thought of the Eucharist as a converting sacrament. This is something where you're in a service and there's preaching and there's reading of scripture and there's praise, and you get to the table and you feel drawn to come down. It's like it's like an altar call every Sunday, right? There may be people who are not baptized or who never heard the gospel. When that invitation is made, I love the Iona community, and it's welcome their Eucharist, and we read it out every Sunday at our Eucharist. If you've been here a long time, if this is your first time, if you feel worthy or you don't feel worthy, if you're everyone is invited to come and taste and see that the Lord is good.
Yeah.
In my mind, if they're not, and I don't always know people that are coming down for Eucharist and their first time they've been to my church, sometimes we're drawn to that meal, and we can worry about we can, get them baptized and we can catechize them and all that stuff down the road. I don't want to erect barriers to God, or barriers to this meal, or barriers to redemption, or barriers to reconciliation, forgiveness that's offered in the meal. It's not that Iona welcome said it's not the meal of the church. It is of this church. It is of, God has set the table in the presence of our enemies, right? And welcome our enemies and us to sit at the table, because God doesn't have, we might have enemies, God doesn't have enemies when it comes to human beings. And so, and I was very inspired by Francis, and I wrote something in Christianity Today, 2013 or so, around the time that he was elected. Might have been back further than that. I lose track of time. Because these Argentine journalists had talked about how he had encouraged his priests to leave the churches, the four walls, and go and do Eucharist on the street corners and alleyways and parks and things, out, because the people weren't coming to church. So let's take this out into the world. And there's actually pictures of him as a cardinal archbishop offering in an alleyway, offering the Eucharist. And he said, if they have a bucket of water, and if they're not baptize them, And
that's so funny.
And I think that there's something. I mean, whether you agree with all of that or not, and maybe that scandalized some people, and I don't want to scandalize anyone, but the who have ideas that there's just, this is the way it's done, and this is the order in which it's done, or whatever. But there's something about the radical hospitality and welcome and going of that attracts me. And because I think that's the kind of table God sets. I mean, I think he is desirous to redeem all of creation, all of humanity. And sometimes we let, the Jewish authorities did this. They erected barriers, to grace, and Jesus was constantly calling them out on. I mean, I think if he calls them out on anything, that's the thing he's constantly calling. You've drawn a line where I'm not drawing a line. You've erected barriers where I've not erected barriers, and you closing off redemption and reconciliation and renewal and healing and deliverance and all the goodness that comes from God to people. And it was offensive to the God who's human, and he let us know. So I also think Christians should be taking the Eucharist together. I've been involved in the ecumenical movement for a long time. And New Ecumenism I worked for a magazine of the New Ecumenism in Chicago for 6 years. And a lot of times you would, hear this, it's like premarital sex to take communion together as Christians if we don't have agreement in doctrine and who's in charge and all these kind of things. And I almost bought into that idea for a moment, but then I began, especially as getting back into the local church and being a pastor, it became clear to me we can have dialogues and study papers and conferences and stuff. That's never going to bring unity between Christians. No. What brought unity between Christians and the Charismatic movement before all the church authorities started saying, no, you can't do that. You can't was when they would get together and take the Eucharist together. The Spirit was poured out on all flesh, right? And everybody there was great unity and vibrance and love and fervency. And actually, Chris Armstrong done some work on this and shows the founding of the Disciples of Christ and the founding of the Churches of Christ and Stone Campbell movement. Almost, and Bill D'Artiaga has written a lot about this. Lots of moments of awakening and revival and quickening and so forth you hear about in the history of the church have been around the Eucharist and celebrations of the Eucharist. A lot of work that's been done on this, and I've become convinced that it's not when we get all together, because we're never going to agree on every jot and tittle. We're not going to agree on who's supposed to be in charge of things. But when we do get together for that meal, something happens. So one of my thoughts I've got several thoughts. One of the thoughts is that where does the Eucharist take place? When we celebrate a Eucharist, what's the location of Eucharist? Well, if you read ecumenically, almost everyone, it's a journey to the world that's coming to this world. It's an eschatological meal. We are both in the little rooms that we're in, or the living room that we're in, or the cathedral that we're in, or the little white clapboard church in the middle of the prairie. Wherever it is, we're there, but we're also taking a journey to the world that's coming to this world. And so that's why in the great Orthodox churches, you see all of the saints and the angels and painted along the walls, because we believe that we're headed to the end, right? To where God is. With the angels, we're surrounded by all the company of heaven, and it's right there in the words of the liturgy. So mystically, we are both very much still in a particular location, under a tree in Uganda, or wherever it is that the Eucharist is, in the middle of a battlefield with the chaplains or whatever. Wherever it's being celebrated, we're also entering that realm of the world that's coming to this world. What is true about that place? One is, there's no longer Baptist or Anglicans or Methodist or Seventh-day Adventist or Mormon. There's just the church, right? There's just all the nations gathered to God. And so if our Eucharist, our participation in that supper where God has invited everyone and there are no divisions, I believe on the basis of that, because there's no division of the church in the future, on the basis of what the church is in God's eyes in the future, in the present moment, we can take Eucharist together despite our divisions.
Yeah.
Now, I don't say this to make people rebellious, quote unquote. I've had a numbers of young people who've come into, been at Redeemer, who've gone to Catholic universities, and then I think it's part of their recruitment strategies, but they won't let them take Eucharist in their chapel services because they're not Catholic.
Right.
And when they've told me, what do I do? What do I do, Father Ken? And I personally, I've always told them, here's a prayer to pray. Because I don't want them, I want people respecting the teaching of our church if they're coming to our church, and I want them to respect the teaching of whatever churches they're visiting, or wherever they may be. Even though I believe that we should be taking Eucharist together, I think it's important to respect the different teachings of the different churches, and unless they're harmful or abusive or something.
Sure.
But on this particular question, Christians can disagree, right? But so I taught them, and I teach them to pray this prayer as they're going to the Eucharist, and they know they're not welcome to take Eucharist there, is to say, Jesus, give me a participation in your suffering. Give me a participation in your sorrow over the division of your church. In John 17, you pray that they would, to the Father, may they all be one as you and I are one, that they might be in us and that we might be in them. We know that's the desire of God. Approach for your blessing instead of, receiving the Eucharist, and just say, Lord, give me a participation in your sorrow over the division of the church. That takes it out of this sort of narcissism where I'm being disinvited or not allowed to take the Eucharist, and into the participation in the suffering of God for the division of his body. And I find it to be a very healthy, spirituality to encourage these young people, both to think about the unity of the church and to think about God's experience of this brokenness
that
of
disunity.
his body.
Yeah. What do you think it's in us because there is this weird dynamic that you look at something that's meant to be so inclusory, it's meant to bring us together, it's meant to be a way that we all unite regardless of our beliefs, regardless of our little bits of theology here and there, and our backgrounds and our race and our creed and whatever. What do you think it is that for some reason inspires us to use it as the opposite, to use it as a gate that keeps you out, as well, we've got to tick these boxes and then you can have this, or even possibly even as a weapon to some degree. It's almost weaponized, and because it feels like this is something that we see again and again in the history of the church, as we take these practices that are meant to draw people in. This is what, like you're saying, Jesus is like constantly going nuts, isn't he? He's like, are you kidding me? Like, how has this become a line in the sand? And he's kind of constantly trying to rub this line in the sand out, or go across the line and go, I'm just going to stand on the other side then. If that's your line, I'll go stand on the other side. But what do you think it's in us that causes us once to draw these lines? And because I'm aware that I want to live without those lines. I want to live beyond these kind of dualities and include all people. But I'm also aware I have my lines. I'm not necessarily aware of what they are. If I was more aware, I might be trying to erase them. But what do you think it is that's that, like it or not, with intentionality or not, we kind of like veer towards creating these exclusionary practices around things like the Eucharist?
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts on why we've done that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, inclusivity can become an ideology too, right? I mean, there is an invitation, there is a welcome, but there are, I mean, just to get very practical, someone who's a pedophile cannot just be loosely a part of a local church body without, very, very strict rules and boundaries and safety and processes and all kinds of things in place. And so, we do in the church, for the safety of children and for the safety of the vulnerable and so forth and so on, we do draw lines. And this is not to say that anyone is outside of the redemptive power of God, but that we also have a responsibility to protect the poor and the vulnerable and the child and so forth and so on. To reverse all of that, we also have this tendency to not welcome children, like, that child cannot receive, baptism, until he's a certain age and can think for himself and make a decision for himself, which is very odd because, a lot of even people, especially people who think that, you don't have a choice about, like, it's like God is the one who chooses you. And it's not about your volition, are some of the strongest ones in saying they have to make a decision before they can be baptized. When it's all about grace, I mean, it just gets confusing sometimes. I don't know if we actually believe that salvation is just a freely offered gift. It doesn't require us to have a particular quality of faith, and doesn't require us to have a quality of volitional decision. If that's true, we're all in trouble. If the quality of our decision or the quality of our belief, or it's a gift, and and everyone is included and I think invited is a stronger word, to participation in the mystery. I think the reason we throw up boundaries, and sometimes it's we want to protect our church and our church's way, and our church, we've got this all figured out better than anyone else, and we're sort of protecting our way of doing all of these things, and you've got to accept all of this and then you're welcome. Literally, like, it's about protecting, don't go off to this church, and, participate in sacraments, because this is the only place where you can get the real thing, is put into people in order to protect the organization, the institution, and so forth and so on. Sometimes it's more like it's driven by false ideas of what Paul's talking about with, you get this even in free church or Pentecostal, because I was raised with this, the reason they don't take the Eucharist, they only take it quarterly, or it had a lot to do with like taking it unworthily, right?
Yeah.
And all the misunderstandings of First Corinthians that are going on there. And what if somebody were to take it, which is really strange to me, because I think sometimes you have to bring, philosophical categories into the first Christians did, into our understanding of things like this. First of all, where I start with is, can taking the Eucharist harm you? That's the first question that you have to ask in a question, a situation like that. Is it possible to take God and Jesus into yourself and for that to bring harm? I don't think there's anything in the Gospels. Everywhere Jesus goes, he's a walking, talking tree of life. It's only deliverance. It's only healing. It's only resurrection. It's only redemption. It's only like total transformation and goodness that's occurring. So, and God is only light and life and goodness and health and strength. And so the Eucharist, if it is the body and blood of Christ, is only redemptive and only healing and only life-giving and only, so, this idea that we can have a sort of state of perfection in which we're now worthy to approach. No, the meal is for the sick. The meal is for the lost. The meal is for the broken. The meal is for the oppressed. In order to redeem us and heal us and free us. And I think N.T. Wright's done some really good work, and others, just like how this is a misunderstanding of Paul in general. That's been, and I think, I'll just be honest. I think it's the work of the enemy of our souls, to bring division about what the Eucharist is, so that we can't take it together. Bring division over who's allowed to have it and who's not allowed to have it, and also to bring division, to make us afraid of taking the Eucharist, because either together or for ourselves, because we could do harm. And it's the same thing with baptism. I think there's a lot of all the troubled waters around baptism comes from the same place. It's if we had unity in baptism, and we had unity at the supper, it would be such a powerful thing within humanity, as a whole, and so powerful to creation if Christians had unity on these particular things. And so I do think that there's not a little bit of the demonic and what is, keeping. Yeah.
I remember as a kid, I say kid, probably teenager, but I would like constantly, every Sunday, I remember this kind of tension where they made such a big deal. If you're not worthy, you better get right with God before you touch that cup or you'll drop dead. Not quite, but like, that's how it felt. Maybe they weren't quite as explicit. My memory is not that great, but like it was intense. I remember literally the cup would be getting closer and closer. And I'm like, God, I'm sorry for on Thursday when I masturbated, and I'm sorry on Friday when I did this, and I'm sorry that I did that, and I'm trying to get right with God before I touch that cup or take that bread, or it was really intense. But at the same time, I wouldn't let it pass, because I didn't want everyone else to then look at Phil and go, well, I know he's a Christian, he's not taking it. Well, what stuff have you got going on? It's like, and I would literally torment. Kind of, I was literally tormented every week by this kind of process. And so this is what I guess I can see that dynamic where whatever people's concepts are of the demonic and Satan, but all at its bare base level of Satan being the accuser. There is nothing more accusatory going on within me than that. I'm getting accused by people that as I imagine them to be. I'm getting accused by myself. I'm being accused by God in my mind, and all these different things are happening. It was a very tormenting kind of process. Something I'd love your opinion on. So a huge amount of people listening to this are are not a part of a local church as it stands right now. Now, they might be
Yeah.
engaging with church as a concept in different ways, a lot of them.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are left going, I can't do it. I've been abused in different ways religiously. I can't connect with a local institution. And I don't know how to find other people like me. And that's a whole nother topic of how do you find people that aren't going to church. You know, you leave the Church of God and you go to a charismatic church. Well, you know where to go. You go to a charismatic church. You go, I'm not really charismatic anymore. I'm more Baptist. Well, I'll go to a Baptist church and I'll find more people like me that will connect with me. But when you start to go, I can't really engage with God in this way, you miss all sorts of different elements like community and different elements of that. But I know for a lot of people, some of the components that they miss are the Eucharist as a body, as community, as a group. I think there's profound beauty in taking the Eucharist as an activity that we do individually, reflectively, and we do that as taking a part of the body globally, but in a more metaphysical kind of sense rather than they're everywhere with us right now. But there is something about getting together and breaking blood, breaking bread, taking wine with one another. Do you have thoughts on how people can engage with the Eucharist outside of traditional institutional formats? Is that something you think about or have explored?
Yeah, I first of all, I'm a very big proponent of the local church, and I know it flows from something that's not vocational to me, because for 6 years, I wasn't in charge of a local church, and I was just working for a magazine in Chicago, and every Sunday we bundled the kids. We had 6, 7 children. And we just went, we went and we were part of a local body and served in different ways, but I wasn't responsible,
Yeah.
But I also deeply understand, that the church and local churches and denominations and organized institutional Christianity has done a lot of harm, not only in our moment, but historically. I'm not in denial about the way the church has been abusive, and that people just come to a point where they just throw up their hands. And Redeemer, the church that I'm part of it, I think, came from the 6 years that I was in Chicago, and I was commuting about 2 hours one way and 2 hours home most days. Sometimes I could get it down to 90 minutes because I lived in the far western suburbs. But people got to know that I was a priest over time. I was doing this for 6 years. And trains and subways began to know who I was, and they would come up to me and talk to me about, like, they read something in the Tribune, or they read something in the Sun-Times, or they've been thinking something about going on with their families, and they would come and sit with me on a train or subway and talk to me about their life and what was going on in their world. And I began to have conversations with people, not in a church setting, not in an ecclesial setting, just in a normal everyday setting, and learning how to have those conversations and learning to listen. First of all, we just are always think we have to talk. And I think part of what it means to be a Christian is to listen. And I think listening to the suffering of people around their experience in church, and not giving our answer and not providing the solution or is a great discipline and a necessary task of the Christian, to just be still and listen to people's pain, and sit with them in the things that they've experienced, that have gone wrong in the church, whether it's like a community that was just organized as a house church, or whether it's just the Roman Catholic Church, or whether it's whatever it is, where they've experienced harm, is to respect them enough to be still and listen to their pain and their suffering and the ways that it has impacted and their life.
Huge.
Before we start, just jumping into our solution. I've got a lot of young men work under me, and I think one of the things, young women, and one of the things that I think we do wrong in ministry is, someone approaches us with a problem, and we're like, "Oh, here's your answer." I think it's really, and Jesus, listened to people and heard their stories, and then spoke out of listening and being with them and hearing their story. So I want to start off by saying, let's be respectful of people and their stories and their hurts and their, at the same time, whether you're meeting in a kitchen around a table, you're meeting in a prison, which I've done, whether you're meeting in an office, or you're meeting under a tree, or you're meeting in the midst of war, or you're, as Francis would do, you're on a blind alley. Where is Jesus? He wasn't, and he doesn't show up he does go to the temple. He had actually, it says it was his custom to go to the temple, but he doesn't show up there first. He shows up in a cave in a small town, and nobody knows that he's born, and nobody knows that he's there. So he's in obscurity, and he delight. This is a God that delights in obscurity and not having the limelight and not having the Klieg lights on him and so forth. And so it doesn't matter where you are. The Eucharist can be celebrated anywhere. In the midst of chaos, in the midst of business going on around the world, and Francis was doing these in markets where there's people walking by, and we've done Eucharist in parks, and I said some of these revivals, they used to go out to the prairies and set up tents and have these Eucharistic festivals and so forth. It can happen anywhere, in any place, at any time. You can set up an altar in the world anywhere, and God is, he's already present, but he will make himself specially present in bread and wine. I believe that. That's a conviction that I have.
And so it's important right now, especially when people aren't able to go anywhere. They are stuck in their homes. The local church that me and Tilly go along to occasionally, they are doing Zoom lessons or whatever, but they send out an email ahead of time, and they don't do Eucharist every week. I think they actually have started to, but I think they started to because of this actually. But they literally say, "Oh, make sure you've got some bread for our Zoom service, because we're all going to break bread together, and make sure you got a glass of wine or something that is representative for you." And there is something quite beautiful about being able to break bread together and to
I do
that together.
I do respect that people have different, this is a very unusual moment, right? And some people are questioning, can a pastor over the computer or devices or whatever consecrate the bread and wine that are on your table? And people have, it's a very unusual moment. People have different ideas. What we did in our local churches is consecrated bread for 7 or 8 weeks and then distributed it to everyone. Okay. So they have it in their homes, and it's been interesting because people have remarked we just sense the presence of Jesus with us in the midst. And we started talking about it. It was like, oh wow, we've set up these home altars in all of our homes, and the presence of Jesus is there in the bread. Of course, he's there anyway, always, all the time. But there's this special presence that he's made himself available to us in bread. And it's problematic, distributing wine to everyone as well. But we did it in a very safe environment, and safely delivered it to them with all these protocols in place to maintain safety. And that's the way we pursued it. And other people have done other things. And I think you just have to figure out where you are, in your local situation with it. It's very vital to us. And I did not want to, for years, say weekly participation in this meal is a vital part of discipleship and of how we understand ourselves as human beings in the world, related to the human God, and how this meal informs our whole view of the world, as you suggested earlier, and changes how we perceive everything, and then take it away in the moment of crisis and say, oh, it's superfluous. Oh, it's not, we can have, it's non-essential. No, just, for us and for our community, no way were we going to go that route. And so we made it, we continue to make it vital. And it took an effort. We had a lot of volunteers driving around and getting masked and getting gloves and doing all these things, instruction about how to maintain distance and stuff. And we got it done.
It's been so interesting to see how, because I'm probably I enjoy a bit of liturgy here and there, but I'm probably not the most structured believer in the world when it comes to how I organize myself and engage with God. And one thing I found so beautiful is watching how different people in different backgrounds, different denominations. I thought the Catholic Church did really well in this of talking about, okay, obviously we're not going to be able to, bless our wafer and put it in your mouth, and we can't even leave the house. And so how they engage with, okay, we're going to have to look at this slightly differently. You're going to have to look at the what you participate in as consecrated in and of itself, and in different segments did this differently. Or I was reading today about two Sikh doctors, I think in Canada, that chose to shave their beards off so they could wear masks. And I don't know how much you know about Sikhs, but that is a huge deal to shave their beard off. I mean, it's hard to compare what that's like to most Christians. We don't have the same sort of practices or anything like that. But looking at people, and I think what they said was, they basically said, look, our they didn't use the word superstition. I'm trying to think what the right word. Our traditions are there to bring us closer to the divine. And anytime they hold us back from loving other people, from loving God in other people, then the traditions are immediately to be put to the side. And I thought that's a beautiful way of understanding that this is transcending any of our little systems that we've got in place to make it work. At the end of the day, God will, oh, sure, we can work around that.
I agree. My bishop has said to us several times during this, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath.
Absolutely.
And he always says it just before he says, it offers us some flexibility on, how to think about this tradition in light of the circumstances that we're walking through.
Yeah.
And I think that is really at the center of Christ's own word, that the tradition, I agree with the Sikh.
Yeah.
It's exactly these traditions are meant to, to cause us to thrive in relationship with God, and they're not a means to an end, right? We can alter a practice in order to serve humanity.
God's not sitting up there going, oh God, I hope his beard's long enough, or whatever. I'm sure that's not what God's orientating his existence around.
My physician told me that if I were in a situation where I had to visit a COVID-19 patient, that I would have to shave my beard.
Yeah.
This hasn't occurred yet, but it could occur. Yeah. And I haven't shaved my beard since,
I was going to say that it looks like
Chicago
something that's taken some work.
1999 or 2000 or something. I mean, it's been trimmed, obviously, but
yeah.
But I've not been clean shaven in
20
years.
Yeah.
So
it is interesting.
I would do it I would do it if I have to go somewhere, because that's
of course, right.
the protocol, you know?
Yeah. It is interesting. I don't know if you saw, I think a couple of days ago, I posted on Instagram, there's a little poll done by Pew Research, and they found that in America across the last kind of month, despite most churches having been closed, Americans across the board stated that they felt their faith was stronger. So about 25% of Americans said they had a stronger faith than going into COVID, and only about, I think it was 1 or 2% said that their faith was weaker. And I thought it's really interesting how even in taking out so many things that we hold so dear to our faiths, you know, the church gatherings, the getting to break bread together, you know, singing songs together, or whatever are, obviously these traditions look slightly different in different denominations and sects. But there's something beautiful about that being, in a sense, completely unrelated to how deep we can go and how connected to God we can be. And I think there's something quite grounding in that as well. I think that's been a really beautiful thing, in a sense that we, for a lot of people, I think there was a fear of, if people stop going to church, they'll become lukewarm or whatever. But it feels actually, in a sense, people have done quite the opposite. In a sense, they've forced themselves to find a deeper spirituality in the face of problems or things like that. Is that something you've observed in your own community? And
I think there's so much isolation going on that it's hard, especially in Michigan here, and you know, different parts of the United States are more locked down than others, that it's hard for me to get a sense yet, you know, how this is. I don't have a lot of, and I mean, I'd just be anecdotal, and I'd be looking at like things I've seen online or whatever, because we're actually quite cut off. I mean, we're doing Zoom meetings, and we're doing, online church, lots of things that we're a very incarnate community. We had never done any of these things.
Sure.
So it's all very new, and I've actually been busier in this time than any time in my 16 years as a pastor. And I know it seems crazy, but that's,
no, I hear you. I'm busier as well.
So much more trying to stay in touch with people. I haven't, I'll say this, I have not run into yet anyone who's like questioning their faith more in this moment than, I do feel people are, yes. I mean, if anything, they're moving more in a direction of trust and more in a direction of, leaning into, their faith than, being, I don't know, despair or, doubt. I'm sure that it's there and it's happening.
Yeah,
I've just not been exposed to a lot of it because a lot of my ministry, it is about like being out there and being around. I was talking about the subways and stuff, and is being out there and talking with people and interacting with people on the street. I do a lot in our little town that we're in here, so I haven't gotten a real good sense within my community. People seem to be leaning, much more into their connection. But we're also a community of lots of people who've been, my ministry is very focused, not by design or, some kind of meditation about it or like orienting myself this way, but it's always been to the broken and the hurting, been broken or hurt in the church. So I've got a lot of people who are, whatever you want to call it, rechurched or whatever, because they've encountered us, in our community and encountered me or what have you, and experienced the healing, and things that have been hurt for them. And so, and for the most part, I would say everybody's sort of leaning into trust, and it hasn't created a serious doubt. But I don't know. I mean, I think most of us are like this. Is this as bad as it's going to get? I don't know. It seems seems that it could get worse,
or do we have
and
a few cycles, or who knows? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's interesting you say that, the dynamic of you having rechurched people. I've been reading a study by Josh Packard this week, who did a study on de-churched communities. He's a sociologist that studies in different religious aspects, but he studied, he interviewed over 1,000 people that had left church, and they had a whole bunch of hypotheses of why that happens, whether they get married to an unbeliever and they just kind of stop going, or they move to a college town and they give up, or maybe they, they start questioning and the wiles of atheism lead them away, or all these different hypotheses and things that we commonly hear. And what's interesting is across the board, almost unanimously across this group, the number one reason that people had left church was because they hadn't found a place that they could voice who they were, what their journey was, how they saw things to be in their faith, and how they were expressing and exploring their faith. They just got shut down because it was slightly different, or actually, even though it's the same, we've got enough people to say that, and there's people that are more qualified, so you just be quiet, or whatever. And then just, I think yesterday on Instagram, I posted, I don't know if you saw this, I basically posted for people that had started to doubt their faith at some point in their life. And I said, what would you have wanted from your church leaders? And did you get it? And I had a hypothesis, but I had no idea how overwhelmingly true it would be. The vast majority said, all I wanted was someone to listen. I didn't want their solutions. I didn't want their answers. I just wanted them to say, oh, wow, that must be tough going through these questions and not knowing. Oh, I've had a doubt once or twice in my life as well. It's horrible, isn't it? That's all they wanted. And so I think there's, it's going to be interesting how people are interacting. Now they've lost some of that community, and they're trying to figure out their faith in their house, in front of a computer screen, or on their podcasts or whatever. It's going to be interesting, people not having that dynamic at play week in, week out. Because I know a lot of people do have that in churches. There's plenty of churches like what you're talking about. Your church seems to do this very well. A place for people to come and be heard and be listened to. But it will be interesting to see how people, once that's been kind of taken away from them, not by choice, it's not there. And you can, as much as a Zoom meeting is wonderful to get together as a group of 20, 50, 100, 200 people, it's not a place that you can be listened to very well, is it? Because you're not going to get around all 200 people. And it will be really interesting to see how people engage. I'm really intrigued to see, I think this could spark tremendous growth in some areas and present some very unique new challenges in other areas as well. It'll be really interesting.
I agree 100% with everything you're saying. Yeah, it's you need smaller gatherings in order for people to be heard. I think, especially along the lines of what what a lot of people are talking about, they need one-on-one, encounters where they can really be vulnerable and voice their question. And here's the thing, I think, God's really, God's got all the time in the world, and hold on just a second.
You're fine.
Arthur, I'm on we're recording something, so we can't have any other noise in the room. Okay. So, my son is got something going on.
No problem. We can wrap up as well. I was planning on wrapping up quite soon. So.
So So just to, I don't know what kind of editing you need to do there, but I think that you're on to something, and I think it starts with not just having smaller groups where people, you can't do that in a group of 50 people. No. You really can't do that in a group of 25. Maybe if you've gotten to know each other over time, people will be able to express doubts or insecurities or vulnerabilities, or, hey, I've got a different way of seeing this. A lot of that has to take place one-on-one, I think, with people that they trust, but you create an environment within a culture of a church where people know that their questions are welcome, know that their different idea is not going to be shut down. God is very patient. We can see that in the creation. We can see that in the age of the earth. We can see that the age of the cosmos. We can see that in our lives if we're paying attention. Somebody having a different idea or somebody having a question or a struggle is not upsetting to God. And it shouldn't be upsetting to the leaders and, people who are coming alongside other Christians in the community of the church. We need to be much more relaxed, much more unhurried, and much more prone to listening to people than shutting them down or, God's big and it can handle, our struggles.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love your heart. I love what you're doing. I love what you're doing for those groups of people because they're my group. If I've got a group of people, it's the people that are doubting and questioning and figuring things out. And that can be a really scary and lonely process. And the more churches, pastors, people that are there to guide and hold people's hands and comfort them and walk with them through that and suffer with them as well, because it can be very much a suffering in different ways, and a lot of it is sparked by suffering. It's just a beautiful thing that you're able to navigate and incorporate that among people that are also not going through that process, because obviously the vast majority of Christians aren't necessarily going through that, and navigating, holding both types of people in one community can be very complex. And
it does come up for us. It does come up for us that people are like, a lot of what you've been doing lately is aimed at these people who have questions and doubts. And, we don't, we just want to be encouraged and this and that and the other thing. And you remember, oh yeah, okay, right. You've got to balance their concern out as well. But I do think that that the first Christians do give us patterns and all of these ways to begin to bring renewal in our local churches and communities, and whatever they look like and however they're organized, to focus again on the things that are central to the gospel, which is that there is a God who loves the world, who made the world in love, who loves the world so much that he gives himself, all of God, for all of the world. That we have this amazing news that God cherishes humanity, and God cherishes his creation, and that he wants to see it made whole, and he wants to see humanity made well. And he does that by entering into all of our vulnerabilities and all of our contingency and all of our pain and all of our experience, that there is a human seated at the right hand of the Father who has memories of being a child and being bullied or being misunderstood or scraping his knee or whatever, and being sick, who has memories of being hungry and cold in the desert with his disciples, who has memories of losing friends to death, who has memories of feeling depressed and anxious in the garden and questioning. We have a human God sitting at the right hand of the Father who had moments of tremendous feelings, a sense of abandonment, and he remembers all those things as a human being. The Son of God suffered with us, and that's why Hebrews says he is our great high priest and mediator, because he is acquainted with and was tempted in every way that we are, and knows our suffering and knows intimately all these things as God. And he's the one who is coming again. And if he's the one who's coming again, there's no need to be afraid. He's not coming back as a different kind of God or a different kind of human. He's coming back as the one who lays down his life for the life of the world, not a different God. And so this is all such good news, especially in light of what some Christians have unfortunately taught historically, or who teach and proclaim, a false gospel today. And so we've been entrusted with really, really good news. And when people hear it, they're moved to the core of their being, because they're made in the image of this human, who's God, made in the triune image. And so it answers to so many things: our desire for God, our desire for community, our desire just to live whole in a good world, and to live in peace, which is not the absence of conflict, but the transcending of conflict for the sake of justice, and that mercy can be shown and justice can be done. So that's the kind of world we all want to live in. And the gospel is that there's a God who is with us in all this and wants to get us there. So I'm very hopeful, and I see so many signs of renewal in the church. And for those who are like, where can we find, I think more and more and more churches, they might be meeting in a family room, or they might be meeting in the local pub, or they might be meeting in a building that looks like the church. But more and more, there is going to be communities like this, and and there are going to be places to go to be included, and to be heard, and to be able to ask the questions, and to be honest. And a lot of people who in our church that are in recovery have said, where they feel the most in church is like the AA meeting, right? Where you can, say your piece, and be heard. And I do think that there are communities springing up everywhere.
There really are.
And so it's very hopeful for you if you're listening to this. It's on the way. There is a movement that's afoot in the world, and hang on, because things are going to get better.
Awesome. Ken, if people want to get in touch with you, if they want to track you, you've written a book, right? I mean, you've got different stuff going on.
There are books on the way.
Okay.
I have a published book, but they can go to Facebook and put in Kenneth Tanner, and find me fairly easily. I think it's
right.
discernible. Like, I'm a priest, and they can do that.
I'll get the exact link and put it in the show notes.
I have the beard. I'm on Instagram as KenTanner. That's Ken Tanner, all lowercase. They can follow me there. I'm on Medium. Most of my longer pieces are published to something called Medium, which is publicly available. They can just put my name in there and see a bunch of articles. I've written quite a few articles for Sojourners over the years, which is a both online and print publication in the United States.
Yeah.
For Huffington Post over the years, for Christianity Today, just Google me and a bunch of stuff will come up, awesome. That I've written, and
yeah. You don't have too many people that hate you, that if Googling your name can be dangerous.
I don't think so. I'm not narcissistic enough to. I am, like all human beings, have narcissism, but it's been a long time since I've Googled my name to see.
Cool. Well, it might be.
I'm definitely not worried about. I'm not worried about that. So
that ship's
Google away.
Right? I'd see that as a badge of honor. You know, I think that's when you know you've made it, when people care enough to dedicate time of their lives to.
Well, you know, my friends Brian Zahn and Brad Jersak and Paul Young and others. Definitely have a number of detractors.
There you go.
Yeah, I don't think I'm on enough people's radar to elicit any kind of real organized opposition. But
give it time.
I like it that way.
Yeah. Gives you time to focus on what's important. Well, Ken, thank you so much for coming on.
Man,
it was really great to get to know you.
Great to be with you, Phil.
Yeah.
Bless you and your wife and everybody in Middle England.
Yeah, well, hope everything in Michigan is as well, continues to go well for you guys, whatever that looks like. We'll see what the world has for us, but I'm sure that you are doing a wonderful job.
God is present.
Absolutely.
God is present, even before we ask him to be.
Absolutely.
He's with us all. Bless you.
All right. Love you, man. Bye.